Hello friends, welcome to my channel, and in this second video on the development of cardiac system, we are going to discuss about the septation of the heart tube. So first we will see the septum formation in the atrioventricular canal. As we have seen in the last video, we have seen the development of the endothelial heart tubes and how they fuse to form a primitive heart tube, and this primitive heart tube is connected to the pair of dorsal aorta, and at one end it has a arterial communication and at the caudal it has a venous communication. And we have seen how this primitive heart tube will form the four primitive dilatations: truncus, arteriosus, bulbus, cordis, primitive ventricle, atrium and sinus venosus. So in this video we are focusing on the septum formation. So apart from the inflow and outflow tracts, how the primitive atria and ventricles are further divided into right and left, and how they are separated by the septa, and that septa has a foramina to maintain the continuity of the blood flow between the right and left, unlike in the adult heart. So let us see. First we will begin with the septum formation in the atrioventricular canal, which communicates the primitive atrium with the primitive ventricle with bulbus cordis. And then we will see the formation of atrioventricular valves. These are one-way valves which direct the blood from atrium to ventricle. And we will see septum formation in the outflow tract, that is truncus, arteriosus and conus cordis. Conus cordis is a smooth outflow part of the bulbus cordis, which forms the part of the right and left ventricle. It forms the smooth outflow part of the right and left ventricle. And truncus arteriosus is further divided into a pulmonary trunk and aorta by the septum formation within it. And then we will see how these all things end up in formation of the interventricular septum. We have discussed briefly in the last session about the interventricular septum, but in this session we are going to see in detail what are the other contributing factors in the formation of interventricular septum. So when you see why this septation is required, because here the heart is undergoing remodeling from a single peristaltic heart tube into a dual synchronously contracting four-chambered pump with one-way valves. That's why septation is required. And cardiac septation here involves the direct communication between the left and right atria and ventricles, subarterial channels, and development of right and left atrioventricular junction. So initially these all chambers are interconnected. There is a flow of blood between the right and left chambers, but that is not required in the adult heart. In the adult heart it is inflow chamber and outflow chamber. So when you see here, the initial primitive heart tube is like this. It is formed by two endothelial heart tubes, and it will form the four dilatations and undergoes the bulboventricular loop formation or cardiac loop formation roughly around 23rd day, and this looping completes by 28th day, resulting in the truncus arteriosus, bulbus cordis, primitive ventricle, primitive atria and sinus venosus there. So now the septation divides this single primitive heart tube with four dilatations into a four-chambered heart with two flows, inflow and outflow, synchronously contracting with one-way valves. So when you see here, this septation occurs between the 4th and 7th weeks of the development. In the last video we have seen the development of interatrial septum. Please go through that again. So let us begin with the septum formation in the atrioventricular canal. As you already know, the primitive atria communicates with the primitive ventricle via the atrioventricular canal, but the single primitive atrium is emptying into single primitive ventricle and bulbus cordis. But now it is time to divide them into right and left parts, and that happens with the origin of the four endocardial cushions which appear at the atrioventricular canal. As you can see here you can see the common atrioventricular canal, and there is appearance of superior, or you can say ventral inferior, also called as dorsal, and two lateral endocardial cushions. And here there is fusion between the superior and inferior endocardial cushion, resulting in right and left atrioventricular canal. Now the bloodstream is divided into right and left, coming from the common primitive atrium to the common primitive ventricle. This is the first septation, but septation is happening at the atrioventricular canal, that you can see here. So initially the AV orifice gives access only to the primitive left ventricle, and it is supported by a bulboventricular flange. The flange what you see here, this is the bulboventricular flange. So this AV orifice is going only to the primitive left ventricle, but this bulboventricular flange will recede, resulting in the access of the AV orifice to both right and left ventricle. So this whole thing is bulboventricular canal here. Okay. So initially, because of this flange, the blood is going only to the left ventricle and then to the right ventricle. But with the receding of this bulboventricular flange, now blood is going to the both the primitive ventricles simultaneously. And then what happens here? Then there is, you can see, is growth of ventral and dorsal endocardial cushions which project into lumen. Superior and inferior are also called as ventral and dorsal respectively. And there is a division of AV canal into right and left by the end of the 5th week. So we have seen in the previous discussions, when you take the oblique section, how it appears. This will be the truncus arteriosus, and here will be the primitive atrium. Here will be the primitive ventricle. Primitive atrium will be here, primitive ventricle, and here will be the part of bulbus cordis and truncus arteriosus. So here is the appearance of this ventral and dorsal endocardial cushions which grow towards each other, dividing the flow into right and left, which are opening into the common atrium. Or if you take a section here, if you take a section, oblique section, which we usually see how it appears. If you take a oblique section, so here will be the primitive atrium and ventricles here. So we have seen the opening of sinus and sinoatrial orifice. We have seen there will be formation of septum primum, but here there is a formation of septum intermedium, dividing this common AV canal into right and left. And with the septation, the interventricular septum also grows towards it, and even septum primum also grows towards it. So this septum intermedium, which is dividing the AV canal into right and left AV canal, is very important in the septation of the atria and ventricles. So let us see the section here. When you see through the cardiac loop here, primitive atrium, ventricle, bulbus cordis, truncus arteriosus, AV canal is there. So these are the two endocardial cushions which are growing towards each other, and that is septum intermedium. So septation, that is the right part of the AV canal. The blood is flowing from atrium to ventricles, and left parts. So in this oblique section, you are going to see, you can see there, and these all septations are forming simultaneously, but they have contribution and impact on each other's development. You can see the fused endocardial cushion there, that is dividing the common, you can see it is dividing this common AV canal into right and left. So that is the septations of the AV canal. Next, formation of the atrioventricular valves. So we have seen this ventral and dorsal endocardial cushions, they fuse and form AV canal. They divide the AV canal into right and left. But what about the lateral endocardial cushions? These lateral endocardial cushions, they are involved in the formation of AV walls, which are surrounded by the proliferation of the mesenchymal cells. With the bloodstream, this mesenchymal cells proliferate and they are hollowed and they become fibrous. They become fibrous and they are covered by endocardium, and they are attached to this ventricular wall by the way of chordae tendineae and papillary muscles. In this way, the right, that is the right AV walls that we call it as the tricuspid wall, has 3 walls, and the left AV wall that we call it as bicuspid wall, that has 2 walls. So you can see here, with the proliferation of the mesenchymal cells in the ventricular wall, there is trabeculations, that is lacunae develop there, and these lacunae are hollowed out due to the blood streams, and later they form these irregularities called as trabecular carneae, and they also happen to form the AV walls there, and these AV walls are attached to the trabecular carneae by chordae tendineae and by the way of papillary muscles. So you can see in the purple color, you can see the formation of AV walls and how these chordae tendineae, the collagenous threads and papillary muscles which are covered by endocardium are formed. That is the formation of AV walls. Next, coming to the anomalies of the AV canal. Sometimes the AV canal may be persistent without the formation of the AV walls, absence of AV walls, where the atria and ventricles are communicated without any separation, and tricuspid atresia, sometimes the walls do not form. So tricuspid atresia resulting in the right atrial hypertrophy, and Epstein's anomaly. You can see here, this is the tricuspid atresia, and in the Epstein's anomaly, the tricuspid wall complex is migrated towards the apex of the right ventricle, so that there is right atrial hypertrophy and small cavity of the right ventricle is resulted. Next, coming to the septum formation in truncus, arteriosus and conus cordis. See, to understand the development of interventricular septum, we should first understand the septum formation in the truncus, arteriosus and conus cordis. Because without the septum formation in the outflow channel, without dividing the truncus, arteriosus into a pulmonary trunk and aorta, we cannot have a separation of ventricle into right and left ventricle. Because the right and left ventricular, when they are separated by the septum, there should be a separate outflow channel for each ventricle. That's why first we are discussing the formation of septas in the truncus, arteriosus and conus cordis. So let us begin. Let us revise what is truncus arteriosus. As we have already seen, during the cardiac loop formation, there are different dilatations, and truncus arteriosus forms the cephalic portion of the U-shaped bulboventricular cardiac loop, and it lies outside the pericardial sac. Some part of the truncus arteriosus dilates to form the aortic sac. Aortic sac, it communicates with both the dorsal aorta here that we have seen, the right and left dorsal aorta, by the 6 pairs of aortic arch arteries. So if the truncus arteriosus is here, this much is truncus arteriosus, outside the pericardial sac, it is forming this aortic sac, and this aortic sac is connected to the 2 dorsal aorta, right and left dorsal aorta, by the different arch arteries. There are 6 pharyngeal arches, the 5th one disappears. So there are 6 pharyngeal arteries, the 5th one disappears there. So by this way, the truncus arteriosus is communicated with the dorsal aorta. And during 5th week, what happens here? There will be development of truncal ridges. Just like what we have seen, the different components are formed during the formation of inferior septum, like septum primum, septum secundum. Like that, there will be appearance of truncal ridges in the truncus arteriosus. One ridge lie on the right superior wall and another on the left inferior wall. So you can see here how this truncal ridges are formed here. One will be formed here and one will be formed here. One on the right superior part of the wall of the truncus arteriosus and one on the left inferior part of the wall of the truncus arteriosus. So the right superior swelling grows distally and to the left, distally and to the left. So this what you are seeing here, this right one is growing superiorly and distally to the left, whereas the left one, left inferior swelling is growing into distally and to the right, distally and to the right, like this. They are forming the septum here. So like this, and both swelling grows towards the aortic sac in a spiral fashion in the anti-clockwise direction. They are growing there and dividing the truncus arteriosus into a pulmonary trunk here, and an aortic sac like that. So the blood from this, if you see this is a right ventricle and this is a left ventricle, the blood from the right ventricle, that is growing into the pulmonary trunk, then like this, then goes posteriorly, whereas the blood from the left ventricle goes into aortic vestibule there, then comes here, then comes like this. So there are two opposing channels for the outflow of the blood, but the division is in the spiral fashion. This spiral septum is formed due to the direction of the blood flow and also by the cardiac neural crush cells. So these two truncal ridges are growing towards each other in a opposing fashion, in a spiral fashion, in anti-clockwise direction, dividing the truncus arteriosus into an anterior pulmonary trunk and posterior aortic sac in the proximal portion. In the middle portion, they are coming left and right. Left side pulmonary trunk, right side aortic sac. In the distal portion, anterior is aortic sac, distal is posterior is pulmonary trunk, just like what we see in the adult heart. If you just revise the course of the ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk, you can get the orientation of the spiral septum here. You can see here in the diagram, you can see this is a right truncal ridge growing distally and to the left, this is the left one growing distally and to the right, and they are forming a septa here, they are forming a septa. So if you see the division here, it is by the spiral septum. You can see that, you can see in this adult heart here how it is. In the adult heart, in the proximal portion, anterior is pulmonary trunk, posterior is aorta. In the middle portion, left is pulmonary trunk, right is aorta. In the distal part, what happens? Anterior is aorta, posterior is pulmonary trunk. So that is the septation of the truncus arteriosus by the aorticopulmonary septum. So in the proximal part, the aortic pulmonary septum is coronally oriented, means it is dividing the truncus arteriosus into an anterior and posterior part. That is, in front you have pulmonary trunk, posteriorly you have aorta, and that fused with the distal bulbar septum of the conus cordis, that we will see in the further slides. Further above, the septum is oriented sagittally, so that pulmonary trunk lies on the left side, aorta on the right side. Here you can see here in the proximal portion, anterior is pulmonary trunk, posterior is aortic sac. In the middle portion, pulmonary trunk is on the left side, aorta is on the right side. In the distal portion, anterior is aorta and posterior is pulmonary trunk. So like this, the truncus arteriosus is divided by a anti-clockwise direction rotated spiral septum into two outflow channels. So further above, the septum oriented again coronally. So the further above, when you see here, you can see in this diagrams, you can see in the distal portion, in the middle portion, and in the proximal portion, middle portion and distal portion, how the truncus arteriosus is divided and you can see in the distal part again it is coronally oriented, dividing into aorta anteriorly, pulmonary trunk posteriorly. So in the proximal it is oriented coronally, in the middle it is oriented sagittally, and again in distal part coronally oriented. Like this the aorticopulmonary septum is formed, and when you see this, when you open through the bulboventricular canal here, you can see there is these are the right and left bulbar ridges. Here we are showing the bulbar septum here, and you can see there is a development of primitive interventricular septum, that is muscular portion there, and both the ventricles are connected by the interventricular foramina. And here you can see the septum intermedium, and here will be the truncus arteriosus. There you can see. So yes, so this is how these are right and left bulbar ridges here. This is the right dorsal bulbar ridge, left ventral bulbar ridge. They form the proximal bulbar septum and distal bulbar septum, then aorticopulmonary septum. So you can see here the interventricular septum roughly we can see. So these all aorticopulmonary septum, bulbar septum are involved in the formation of interventricular septum, so that blood from right atria moves to the right ventricle, then to the pulmonary trunk. Here is the truncus arteriosus. The truncus arteriosus is connected to both the dorsal aorta by different arch arteries, which undergo modifications to form the different major arteries like subclavian, common carotid, and arch of aorta. So that is the aortic sac. You can see now the bulbus, cordis, and truncus arteriosus. What happens here? So in the lower part you are seeing this. Yes, here you can see the proximal bulbar septum will develop by the right dorsal and left ventral bulbar ridges, and soon there is formation of spiral septum there. Spiral septum will develop. How? In a spiral fashion. How in a spiral fashion? So first here it is coronally oriented, then it is sagittally oriented, again it is coronally oriented. So this aorticopulmonary septum divides the truncus arteriosus into two channels like this. You can see there on the left and right, you can see. Okay, you can notice there. Now if you see here, this is truncus arteriosus. Now you are seeing above is anterior, below is posterior, anteriorly pulmonary trunk and posteriorly aortic sac. You are seeing, yes, if you cut here, you can see the development of semilunar walls also. They are formed by the bulbar ridges, the conus cordis there. They are formed by the conal ridges. They form the right and left semilunar walls, that is pulmonary and aortic walls respectively. And these bulbar ridges appear there, covered by endocardium and myocardium, and they form these one-way walls. You can notice. So you can see here, this is how the spiral septum is oriented. Spiral septum is oriented. So first it is coronally oriented, then sagittally oriented, again coronally oriented by the aorticopulmonary septum induced by the cardiac neural crush cells. So more distally the septum is oriented coronally, and this aorticopulmonary septum below it is fusing with the proximal and distal bulbar septums. But what is above? The cephalic edge of septum fused with the dorsal wall of the aortic sac. What is aortic sac there? Aortic sac is the dilated portion of the truncus arteriosus outside the pericardium. To what it is connected? That aortic sac is connected to the two dorsal aortas by what? By 6 pairs of aortic arch arteries. 6 pairs of aortic arch arteries. So this aortic sac here, the aorticopulmonary septum will attach between the 4th and 6th arch, dividing the flow into So the whatever the blood coming from pulmonary trunk goes into sixth arch, and whatever the blood coming from the aorta goes into 1, 2, 3, 4 arches. 1, 2, 3, 4 arch arteries. Like that it will divide. So if you see here, we have seen the aortic sac, how it is connected to the dorsal aorta. It is connected to dorsal aorta by these numerous arch arteries. And if you see, this is the anterior view. If you take a sagittal section, if you take a cut through this one, if you take a sagittal section here and observe, it will appear like this. It is connected to 6 arch arteries. So this is first, second, third, fourth and sixth arch artery. Now this aorticopulmonary septum comes like this, dividing this aortic sac into, we have already seen the truncus arteriosus is divided here into an aorta and pulmonary trunk. So this is the aorticopulmonary septum. It attaches between the fourth and sixth arch arteries. So whatever the blood from pulmonary trunk is going to sixth arch artery, which is going to form the pulmonary artery. So the blood from pulmonary trunk is going to the lungs, and whatever the blood coming from this aorta is going to the first, second, third and fourth arch arteries. The first arch artery forms the part of the maxillary artery. Second arch artery forms the hyoid artery and styloid arteries, whereas the third artery forms the external carotid and internal carotid. Fourth forms the arch of aorta, subclavian arteries, like that. So the aorticopulmonary septum, the cephalic edge will attach between the fourth and sixth arch arteries of the aortic sac. So that is the attachment here, and the direction of blood flow and hemodynamic forces play a significant role in this spiral septum. Next, coming to the conus septum, bulbar septum. In the formation of the aorticopulmonary septum, I told you, in the caudal edge of aorticopulmonary septum fused with bulbar septum. What is bulbar septum here? What is bulbar septum? Where it is formed? The bulbar septum is formed by the two bulbar ridges, the right and left bulbar ridges that you see, right dorsal and left ventral bulbar ridges, like this. They are in line with the proximal portion of the aorticopulmonary septum. So they also help in the division of this conus cordis here. And distal bulbar septum, it is developed by the fusion of right and left cushions. So here you can see what happens here. Right dorsal and left ventral, they form the proximal bulbar septum, whereas the distal bulbar septum is formed by right and left transversely. And these bulbar septum fuse with aorticopulmonary septum, which is spirally oriented. So here we have the formation of proximal bulbar septum formed by the right dorsal and left ventral bulbar ridges, and formation of distal bulbar septum formed by the right and left bulbar ridges, and these both fuse with the caudal edge of the spiral septum, that is aorticopulmonary septum. This aorticopulmonary septum will above fuse with the junction between the fourth and sixth arch arteries. So like this, the truncus arteriosus is divided into two outflow channels, and what are responsible here? These cardiac neural crest cells. So as we have seen, the neural crest cells are also involved in the development of face. So any anomaly resulting in the defective migration of neural crest cells will result in both facial and cardiac anomalies. So usually the person with the congenital anomaly of face have some anomalies in development of heart also. You can see here we can notice this is the bulbar septum here, proximal bulbar septum. It is having a contribution in the development of interventricular septum here. You can see right dorsal and left ventral, and here you can see this yellow portion is the contribution from the septum intermedium. So like this, the two ventricles are communicated with each other by what? This primitive interventricular foramina. Why? Because septations in the truncus arteriosus should happen before we separate the two ventricles. So coming to the development of interventricular septum. See, this interventricular septum starts to develop at the end of 4th week. So whatever we are discussing septation here one by one, but they are happening simultaneously. But the septation of truncus arteriosus, the development of proximal bulbar septum, distal bulbar septum, and the septum intermedium, that is septation of AV canal, are important in the development of interventricular septum. You should understand that. So this interventricular septum, it divides the primitive ventricle into right and left ventricles, and it happens due to the blood flow, because as the blood flow from atria to ventricles, they begin to expand, and there is development of interventricular ridges. Here you can see there is development of a interventricular ridge. Soon it will develop into a primitive muscular interventricular septum. So, and there is a interventricular foramina there between the left ventricle and right ventricle. Okay, so the lower part, first it develops as what? Primitive interventricular ridge. It soon grows to form the muscular portion of the interventricular septum. But the two ventricles are connected by what? This primitive interventricular foramina. That foramina is embryologically essential till there is formation of pulmonary trunk and aortic sac. How it happens? By the spiral aortic pulmonary septum and bulbar septum in the truncus arteriosus and in the conus cordis, that we have already discussed. So what happens here? This primitive interventricular septum, which is muscular, has the two margins. The cephalic margin is concave and it has a right and left margins. So that will go and also form the connection with the endocardial cushions, which are forming the AV canal separation, AV walls. So what happens here? And also there is development of this proximal bulbar septum. So this primitive interventricular foramina is closed by contributions from the proximal bulbar septum and also from the septum intermedium. So there are contribution of three factors in the development of interventricular septum. First is primitive interventricular septum, and then there is proximal bulbar septum, and then there is septum intermedium. That is primitive muscular interventricular septum, next is septum intermedium, next is proximal bulbar septum. So this is how the interventricular septum has two portions. It has a muscular portion and membranous portion. Muscular and membranous portion. So when you see here, we have already seen the development of the atrium septation. Here when you see the interventricular septation here, the lower 3/4 is muscular, upper 1/4 is membranous part. And how this happens here? When I take a section through the bulboventricular loop, first there is a common AV canal. You can see there, common AV canal is there. Common AV canal with the fusion of superior and inferior endocardial cushion. This AV canal is divided into right and left portions. So the blood is flowing to right and left ventricles. But soon there is formation of this proximal bulbar septum, distal bulbar septum, and this spiral aorticopulmonary septum. So what happens here? The muscular part will develop here and the membranous part will develop from the other parts, that is bulbar septum and septum intermedium. So now the blood from the right ventricle is going into the pulmonary trunk from the left ventricle into the aorta with the formation of IV septum, bulbar septum and aorticopulmonary septum. So this is how the adult circulation pattern is established. Let us see here. If you see the truncus arteriosus, you can see the right and left. Yes, these right and left truncal ridges are growing and forming a aorticopulmonary septum, spiral aorticopulmonary septum. So the blue color is the pulmonary channel and pink color is the aortic channel. That is what you are seeing there. So again, when you see the atrioventricular cushions there, that is common AV canal divided into right and left AV canal, and there is formation of the truncal ridges, and also there is development of bulbar septum, and soon this ventricle is divided into right and left by the primitive interventricular septum, but this membranous portion is derived from the bulbar septum and the septum intermedium. So you can see during fetal circulation, the fossa ovalis and ductus arteriosus serve as the shunts because the pulmonary circulation is not happening there, lungs are not well developed. So foramina oval helps in the shunt of the blood from the right to left ventricle, and ductus arteriosus carries the blood from pulmonary trunk to the aorta. Later they become fossa ovalis and ligamentum arteriosum respectively. So this is what happens. Here you can see first this is primitive muscular interventricular septum, then you are seeing this membranous septum. The membranous septum is formed by what? Septum intermedium and also the bulbar septum, and then you are seeing this aorticopulmonary septation. So you can see again in this oblique section here, muscular part, membranous part. But before the formation of the muscular part, there is interventricular foramina. This interventricular foramina is embryologically essential till the outflow tract is divided. That is, truncus arteriosus is divided into pulmonary trunk and aortic sac. Okay. So that is about the development of the interventricular septum. Coming to the anomalies in septation in the interventricular septum, usually the membranous part is involved, resulting in the VSDs. VSD is most common symptomatic congenital heart anomaly, and sometimes there will be persistent truncus arteriosus resulting in the outflow tract reversal, and sometimes you will see both ASD and VSD together. And this is the persistent truncus arteriosus. Here you can see the outflow tract is not divided. Both the pulmonary trunk and aorta have a common outflow channel. They are not divided. And transposition of great vessels, that is due to anomalies in the formation of spiral septum. So instead of the pulmonary trunk opening into right ventricle, it opens into the left ventricle. Aorta, instead of opening into left ventricle, it opens into the right ventricle. It happens due to the deficient migrations of the cardiac neural crush cells, and also due to the anomalies in the elongation of the secondary heart field by the deficient contribution of mesenchymal cells. So this is how the congenital anomalies result. Tetralogy of Fallot. So it involves the infundibular stenosis, ventricoseptal defect, hypertrophy of the right ventricle and overriding of aorta. So that is also a result of the secondary heart field cells, deficient migration of secondary heart field cells, and sometimes there will be valvular stenosis. These are formed by the lateral endocardial cushions. If they don't trabeculate properly, if they don't hollow out properly, then there will be stenosis. So this is about the septation. Hope you had a clear understanding. If you have any doubts, please comment and give your feedback. Thank you.